PBS released a groundbreaking docuseries recently. It's called Black and Jewish America, an Interwoven History, and it digs into the long, complex relationships between Black and Jewish Americans. But one episode in the series really caught our attention. That's because it looks at how the Black and Jewish American bond shaped pop music as we know it today.
Jewish people have always been some of the first, outside of the culture itself, to embrace Black music.
Here to unpack a bit of that story, I've got Mark Anthony Neal. He's a Black American and professor of African and African American Studies at Duke University. Gayle Wald is a Jewish American scholar and the author of This Is Rhythm, Ella Jenkins' Children's Music and the Long Civil Rights Movement. And Jay Smooth is a veteran hip-hop broadcaster and culture critic. He's also biracial, Black and Jewish American. I'm really grateful that you're all here today. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Yes, of course. Listen, Jay, I'll start with you on this. This new PBS doc is one of the first to sort of explore this long history here between Black and Jewish people in the United States. We're going to focus on the ways that that history sort of brought us so much of what we know about pop music right now. But before we dig into that, what should people know about this bond?
Yeah, it's funny. I've actually been surprised to learn how many people aren't familiar with this history because beyond my lineage, just as a New Yorker, I grew up with it as such a part of the fabric where, especially starting from the early 20th century, when so many Jewish immigrants, like my mother's family, came here from Europe to escape the persecution there. And then we wound up living here in proximity to each other, sort of on the margins, each trying to figure out this thing called living in America. And over the years, that's led to many different kinds of relationships that are informed by our shared or similar histories and some of the differences in our positionality. And I think it's a really rich history that's often overlooked, also often oversimplified and over-romanticized, which I don't think this series completely escapes, but I think it does paint a picture of how broad and deep that relationship has been and makes some space for all the nuance and complexity that's there under the surface.
I will say that, Jay, I am among those people. I don't think I was as aware of how deeply interwoven this history is and how far it goes back. So for you, the idea that this is something that you sort of grew up with, I learned a lot from this series. And Mark, I got to tell you, one of the most significant outcomes that I saw in that documentary that I was not aware of is sort of one of the big outcomes of the shared Black and Jewish American history is one of the most prominent civil rights institutions, and that's, of course, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. Do you want to tell briefly the story of how that is the bond that sort of brought this organization to being?
It's the multiracial group of folks who got together to advocate on behalf of African Americans in this country. W. Du Bois, of course, is the most prominent, but Mary Church Terrell and Ida B. Wells are also involved. But when you see that original board, right, the only board member is Du Bois, who's actually like the head of publicity in this context. But a lot of folks don't realize that, this group, which we think of as being synonymous with Black political power to some extent, was founded as a multiracial organization.
Mm-hmm. Gayle, this era of allyship is sometimes called the Grand Alliance. Do you want to talk about why it's called that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was grand for the reasons that we've already talked about. It saw two kind of historically oppressed groups trying to work together toward a common end. In this case, the civil rights movement under King and kind of embodying the beloved community that he talks about. And all alliances, of course, are living things that have to be continuously worked on and for. So that the Grand Alliance was this hard-won product of a particular time and place, although it had roots in earlier decades in the 20th century, progressivism, leftism, Jewish Americans, and African Americans.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the framing of the Grand Alliance sort of implies a mutuality, right? It's sort of like a sort of willingness to say we can depend on one another. And I'm going to come back to that in just a moment. But Gayle, now that we've set this table, let's maybe dig into the pop music aspects of this relationship, the relationship between Black Americans and Jewish Americans. What initially brought Jewish Americans into the music industry?
Yeah, so Jewish Americans experienced significant discrimination well into the 20th century. They were subject to restrictive housing covenants, quotas in higher education, and social and economic exclusion. And their access to various professions was also restricted. So particularly immigrants, not only immigrants, but especially immigrants, in a new country, trying to find a way, turned to the sphere of entertainment as a field that was open to them. Of course, it was a high risk field, both as artists and as entrepreneurs. So they helped to create, Jewish Americans in that field helped to create what we think of now as the Great American Songbook. We have Irving Berlin writing White Christmas,
Yeah.
kind of Jewish Americans kind of giving voice to Americanness in kind of the most celebrated ways. And on the business side, we see folks like, just to cite one, Leonard and Phil Chess, who are Polish American immigrants who start Chess Records in the U.S. They're important to the history of R&B and rock and roll. They put out Chuck Berry and they put out Muddy Waters and many, many others.
There's arguably you can't have this conversation without maybe giving the most famous example of that intertwined Black and Jewish American relationship. I'm just going to play a bit of a clip of this.
Southern trees bear a strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root, black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging.
The one and only Billie Holiday, that is Strange Fruit. Mark, this is a song that comes up prominently in the doc. It sort of frames the entirety of the opening of the second episode of this. For people who are maybe not aware, what's its significance to this conversation?
I remember when I was younger and I first found out that the author of this song was a Jewish school teacher by the name of Abel Maripol. It was shocking to me. Something had circulated as poetry. He, perhaps as a Jewish man in New York City in particular, had freedom to talk about what was happening in the South in ways that Black American artists and musicians clearly weren't able to. But of course, it comes to life, when it's sung initially by Billie Holiday in 1939 and really becomes her signature tune until her death.
Yeah, it was also news to me watching this documentary. Again, I think when I thought about the framing of this documentary and kind of going into it, I was open to learning a lot of new history. I was so surprised to learn about how many significant things sort of have the root at this relationship, the relationship between Black Americans and Jewish Americans. Gayle, when I think of prominent Jewish American pioneers in the music industry, there's a few names that sort of come to mind, right? I think of Atlantic Records exec Jerry Wexler, who coined the term rhythm and blues, shaped the careers of Aretha Franklin, of Ray Charles. Also think of Clive Davis, gave us Whitney Houston, gave us Alicia Keys, paved the way for the creation of arguably one of the most important Black-founded labels, which is, of course, LaFace Records. Who are some of the other important Jewish American names in jazz or soul R&B that come to mind for you?
I'll add some women to this list because I think women may experience this relationship, this Black-Jewish relationship, through the lens of gender. So going back to the early 20th century, Sophie Tucker, who was a vaudeville performer known as the last of the Red Hot Mamas, she befriended many African-American musicians and was covered in the Black press positively, and sometimes she was critiqued in the Black press. And she was originally set to record Crazy Blues, the 1920 blues recorded by Mamie Smith. But Mamie, that was a song that propelled Mamie Smith to fame and established the blues as a major commercial genre for Black entertainers. Florence Greenberg was a rare female record executive and producer who signed the Shirelles. They go on to have a #1 hit as a girl group with Will You Love Me Tomorrow. That's a song that was co-written by Jerry Goffin and Carole King. And Carole King, famously wrote... Carole King wrote, You Make Me Feel Like a Natural Woman for Aretha Franklin, who recorded it in 1967, one of her best known songs.
Yes, of course. Another really noteworthy example of this sort of deep history of the Black and Jewish American relationship in pop music is the one between Louis Armstrong and his Jewish manager, Joe Glazer. Have a listen to this moment from the PBS docuseries.
As a jazz trumpeter coming out of New Orleans, there were certain doors Louis Armstrong couldn't go through. His Jewish manager could get into those doors. He could figure out how to cut the deal. He could figure out what venues to go to. He could figure out how to think about the contract. And so it's that nature of that symbiosis where they each lean into their talents.
That's a moment from the PBS docuseries Black and Jewish America and Interwoven History. Mark, I want to ask you a little bit about this. We talked about the ways that the civil rights movement sort of fostered the sense of allyship and goodwill between Black and Jewish American people. But the pop music industry has been notoriously an exploitative business, particularly, I think, for Black musicians. What did the PBS doc have to say about the ways that that allyship and goodwill between Black and Jewish Americans ended up holding up in the world of pop music?
It's complicated, right? Because someone's political goals within the context of allyship doesn't necessarily trump green money, right? The finance of it all. And that's just the reality, right? The pop music industry is one of the most exploitive spaces in terms of entertainment in this country. There were as many Jewish managers who were exploited of artists as there were Black managers and Black producers and everyone of all other hue and color. And so it's hard to apply a sense that somehow Jewish managers were uniquely exploitive within this context, given it was so wide ranging within the industry at the time.
Mm-hmm. Jay, what about you? What were your takeaways from that aspect of the PBS docuseries?
Yeah, pretty similar to what Mark said. I think, these relationships, these systems, these power dynamics that are built around race and ethnicity are never functioning in a vacuum. They're always intertwined with the imperatives of capitalism. And all things being equal, that capitalist imperative is going to win out a lot of the time. And I think because Jewish people were disproportionately represented in the business side, people can confuse correlation and causality on dynamics that have been playing out that way across the board. And I think because of that, it's worth studying what I think of as basically parallel narratives of this business side relationship, which is a mixed bag, and the many relationships on the creative side with people like the great studio engineer Bob Power, who just passed away, who might not be thought of as often as a representative of this relationship, but really played a beautiful role in supporting and contributing to the art form. So I think it's worth sort of trying to clarify cause and effect and see how different the relationships could be in different circumstances.
Gayle, I see you nodding your head there. I saw you particularly nodding your head when Mark was like, "It's complicated." Do you have anything to add that you want to say there?
Yeah, it's complicated. I mean, I think that African Americans, because African American music is the foundation of American popular music, Black artists have been uniquely and disproportionately exploited in ways that we can't even go into. And I agree, the record industry is an industry, and at some level, it's always beholden to the profit motive. And artists have not been above making choices that benefit their own pocketbooks. So like I'm thinking about in the 80s, the industry began exploiting rap's popularity to sell products like Sprite and malt liquor. And this is all coinciding too with the hyper commercialization, with the post-civil rights rise of neoliberalism, which, emphasizes individualism and entrepreneurialism. So the bigger picture, we're always like kind of putting the bigger picture around it. Yeah.
Oh, Gayle, you totally pre-anticipated exactly where I was going to go, because I do think that like when we sort of arrive at the world of hip hop, something sort of supercharges the dynamic that you're talking about. If folks are just joining us, my name is Elamin Abdelmahmoud, and this is Commotion. And we're doing a bit of a deep dive into the relationship between Black and Jewish Americans and how that relationship ended up shaping pop music as we know it. This conversation is inspired, by the way, by a PBS docuseries called Black and Jewish America and Interwoven History. Jay Smooth is here, Mark Anthony Neal is here, and Gayle Wald is here. Since we're pivoting to the world of hip hop, let's get things moving with this.
LL Cool J is hard as hell. Battle anybody, I don't care, you tell. I excel, they all fail. Gonna crack sales, double L must rock the
Obviously, a bit of LL Cool J, that is Rock the Bells. It's one of the many, many hit records that helped make Def Jam Records one of the most important labels in hip-hop history. That's a label that gave us Jay-Z. It gave us DMX and Slick Rick and Kanye West and the Beastie Boys. Mark, how does Def Jam Records fit into this dynamic we're talking about Black and Jewish American history?
Russell Simmons and Rick Rubin. Though I think in some contexts in the 1980s, particularly around hip hop, folks thought of Rick Rubin less as a Jewish guy and just a white guy that was into hip hop. I think clearly he brought that to the table in terms of identity, and Russell Simmons was conscious of it. But I don't think it was something that they necessarily doubled down in the marketing of their artists, in the marketing of the label and what they were trying to achieve at the time.
Hmm. I do think so. So the reason we're bringing this up is because I want to go back to that framing that we had earlier in the conversation, Jay, which is this idea of the Grand Alliance and the mutuality and the dependence on one another. And then by the time you get into this era, there's a bit of a distortion of that conversation. So Def Jam Records isn't the only hip hop label founded by Jewish Americans. There's also Tommy Boy Records, which gave us De La Soul, Loud Records, which gave us Wu-Tang and Mobb Deep, and then Ruthless, which gave us Bone Thugs and Harmony. But even with those gigantic, massive success stories, some rap artists continue to kind of feel exploited in the music industry in a similar way to their jazz and soul predecessors and how they felt. Do you want to talk a little bit about that sort of element of feeling the exploitation?
Yeah, I think that's something that really started picking up steam in the early 90s when hip hop was fully getting absorbed into the corporate commercial mainstream. That's when you start hearing Q-Tip teaching us about industry rule number 4080, that record company people are shady. That's when you hear GZA drop his legendary verse on Protect Your Neck, excoriating his old label Cold Chill and Warner Brothers for how they treated him. And you'll notice that this is all taking place right at the time that what they called the conscious era was being usurped by what they called the gangster rap era, which these are all oversimplifications too, of course. But you'll see that the pushback and resentment that was growing, I think more than ever, was focused not just on artists getting jerked financially, but on the prospect of the music industry distorting or misrepresenting the culture, just diluting, watering things down, making things more commercial, leaning more into the negativity of what they call gangster rap and other negative messaging. And to be clear, hip hop was never entirely devoid of materialism or violence or misogyny. But I think it's fair to say that the moneymakers saw that as an easy way to make money and didn't seem as concerned about the moral implications. And this is not specific, to be clear, to the sort of Jewish-owned labels that you mentioned. This was happening across the board. But since there is such a prevalence of labels being founded by these Jewish creators, I think that does inevitably become a part of the conversation in complex ways.
We've talked a bunch about the frustrations that some rap acts have had about the commercialization of the genre. Lyor Cohen is one of the big names when it comes to this front, right? He's the former president of Def Jam Records. He's a Jewish American. He's played a gigantic role in the commercial success of rap music. He's been criticized a bunch over the years for that. Lyor, by the way, I should mention, is the current head, the global head of music at Google and YouTube. So what you're going to hear right now is Lyor Cohen on the popular morning show, The Breakfast Club. This is from back in 2018. And in this clip, he's being asked about the role that rappers play in promoting opioid use, specifically the recreational drug lean, which is basically a mixture of cough syrup and soda pop. Have a listen to Lyor talking to Charlemagne.
Now they seem like they're making it cool to be drinking lean and syrup, and
it's the most dangerous. It's the most dangerous thing that's facing our society.
So why sign an artist that would promote that?
Because I already answered that question. You weren't paying attention. She asked me talent or issues, and I said talent. But I have to. I can't give up on people.
But I'm saying that's hypocritical, though. You're saying
it's opportunistic. Yeah. I got people to feed. I got a business to run.
All of you are laughing in response to Lyor's comments there. Jay, let me ask you about that moment, because it is one of the very few moments where that tension is a bit more explicit. It's not normally as explicit as that.
Yeah, let's be clear. I hate it. Okay. The way he's talking right there is reprehensible. I do think he's saying the quiet part loud about a mindset that a lot of people on the industry side operate with. And it's frustrating because I think over the years, in some ways, Lyor Cohen has been unfairly singled out as the face of exploitation, because he's a very brash, over-the-top personality that likes to draw attention to himself. And a part of that persona is, he's very unmistakably Jewish. And that has led to him being singled out in ways that I think are sometimes distorted and somewhat anti-Semitic. So I think it's really unfortunate that he fed right into that narrative with this quote in a way that I think I don't think Russell Simmons, for example, really operates very differently from that, but he would speak on it in lofty terms about letting the poets be free to share their poetry. So it's complicated. I think he absolutely deserves to be called out for that. And I think it's fair to ask, if we have such a special relationship, why does this ruthless capitalism trump that concern so easily for you? But I also think we should be clear that quite a few of the people singling him out for this are misdirecting from their own complicity and similar stuff.
First of all, I appreciate any answer that starts with "thanks, I hate it." That's a perfect place to start any answer. Before I come to you, Gayle, let me ask you, Mark, about your response to that tension that was kind of present between Charlemagne and Leor.
I'm sure in that moment, Cohen is taking an accounting of all the Black people he made money for. Right. And that becomes the way that he rationalizes his choices, right? Including the group that they're talking about in that particular moment, right? I'm helping these people have generational wealth.
You're referencing Migos
right?
there.
So,
Yeah.
Yeah, right. So I'm sure that's how he's referencing it in the context of his mind, right? How he accepts these hard decisions that in other contexts, if we were talking about racism or anti-Semitism, right, that he would not have so easily co-signed in the way that he does in that moment.
Gayle, while it may seem the case that Leor has maybe an easy time evading accountability in that answer, there has also been some deeply troubling cases of anti-Semitism from rappers over the decades, including Public Enemy, but also Ice Cube, most recently Kanye West over several different years. What have you made of these sort of various instances of anti-Semitism over the years?
First thing we have to say is it's not only or exclusive. It's hardly only or exclusively Black rappers in this case. But yeah, I'm old enough I was in grad school when Public Enemy was becoming popular, and yeah, to have someone like Chuck D seeming to co-sign onto anti-Semitic tropes of Jewish global conspiracy, is disappointing, and you grapple with it. I mean, I think we all grapple with, and I think also as a woman, for all of us, different reasons, we can grapple with music that we also care about. I understand that to be part of it. So it's concerning to see, like artists like Ice Cube or Kanye West, even today, disseminating like anti-Semitic tropes on social media, mostly because they have a lot of power, to shape what people think, especially young people. So anyway, that's the bigger context for me.
I guess, like, Mark, the thing is that you're trying to do several things, right? With this conversation, but also in terms of being able to look at these things closely. Like, neither Black nor Jewish Americans created the exploitative system that the U.S. music industry is built on. That did not originate with either one of those groups. But that doesn't necessarily excuse the way that some record executives, some of whom are Jewish, but not all of them, have been sort of implicated in this ongoing exploitation of Black musicians and their audiences. And also at the same time, that none of this is an excuse for the anti-Semitism that you've seen from some of the most famous Black musicians. So where does that leave us, Mark? How do you sort of think about this?
I think we have to parse out a distinction between what this Grand Alliance has meant for individual groups of people, right, over the course of the 20th century, right? And it just does not translate as easily in a capitalistic frame. That's just the bottom line, right? And we have to make one-on-one distinctions on artists and also folks who are involved on the more business side about the choices that they make. Hold them accountable when they need to be held accountable. I mean, Jay, makes a great point, to make a distinction between what it looks like on the business side and what it still looks like on the creative side, right? And I think it's interesting that when you look at Russell Simmons and Rick Rubin, Rick Rubin moves away from the business side and is much more of a creative force going forward when he leaves his partnership with Russell Simmons. And I think that might, in his way, been some sort of response to the fact that, it's an exploitative relationship and Russell can do it far better than I can.
Jay, let me ask you that question.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously complicated. I mean, I think Leor is representative of the sort of differences in positionality that I talked about starting out. He has a relationship with this Black culture and art form where he's able to broker business deals and do business with it in a way that, a lot of Black people aren't as often in a position to do. And he is an example of how that sort of special relationship we may have is going to get trumped by capitalism and you could say maybe white supremacy. I think that deserves to be called out, but it should be called out in a way that is precise and doesn't get misdirected into playing into stereotypes, because I don't think there's any causality in his Jewishness there. Although it can be fair to say it's an example of how this relationship that we have is very conditional and complex. I think we should be clear that we're not calling him out because he's a quote unquote tall Israeli, as most have said. Like this is not actually about that. And I think we should be calling this out, but we should be clear about what we're calling out.
I appreciate that all three of you are saying, hey, there's complexity to sit in here. Let's figure out how to actually sit into it and wade into it. There's one more name that I'd like to drop into this conversation, and that name is, of course, Drake. Drake is Jewish Canadian via his mother. He's also African American via his father, musician Dennis Graham, whose extended family includes the legendary bassist Larry Graham, and also his cousin Teenie Hodges co-wrote a number of classics for Al Green, including Love and Happiness. Gayle, where does Drake, truly one of the most popular artists of our time, sit in this entire discussion that we've been having?
You know, Drake is the most famous Jewish rapper maybe ever. And
yes, he is.
You know, I mean, you could cite the Beastie Boys, you could cite some others, but it's Drake. And you know, he set that video, hell yeah, effing right.
Yeah.
At a bar mitzvah.
It's a beautiful bar
doing
mitzvah.
All the,
yes.
Doing all the recognizable things like reading from the Torah and being hoisted on a chair, you know, as people are dancing the hora around him. And you know, Jewish Americans are obsessed as any other group of people with our representation in popular culture. So the Jewishness of Drake in that video is significant. You know, in some ways, I wish Drake would have, you know, more, give us more. I'm kind of curious about it. But I think, you know, that's significant. So you know, people who are not fans of hip hop know about Drake for that reason, you know, talking about Jewish people.
No, I was gonna say though, like that's my favorite Drake video, exactly for the reasons that you mentioned. I think like you've never seen Lil Wayne happier than he is at Drake's bar mitzvah. Like, he's truly just kind of delighting in all of it. Mark, same question to you. Where does Drake sit in this entire conversation?
You know, Drake is such an interesting and an odd figure, right? Because he's an outlier, right? Because he's a Jewish rapper. He's an outlier because he's Canadian. He's an outlier because he's a rapper who sings better than he raps. All those things. You know, so when you
Mark got bars. Okay, let's go. Yes.
So when you hear go not like us, right? I mean, it's all of the above.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. It's Drake contains truly multitudes. Some of the same multitudes that you contain, Jay. Where do you fall on this?
Yeah, you know, it's funny. I interviewed Drake many years ago and spoke to him about our shared experience. And it was interesting because he basically told me that growing up in Canada, he never really had to reckon with these questions as much as we do in America, and just kind of started grappling with it when it came here. And you know, Drake is obviously, there's been quite a bit of discussion of Drake in recent years, and he frustrates me because I think he could have kept evolving into a really interesting case study of this mixture of cultures and representation, but I don't think Drake, I think people forget he's been famous since he was 14 years old. I don't think Drake ever really figured out who Drake is or who Aubrey Graham is. And in the last 5 or 10 years, I think he's just kind of evolved into this sort of hollow, artificial, like it doesn't really feel like there's a person there. So I don't think he's lived up to what he's basically evolved. You know, Yiddish has contributed many beautiful words to the common parlance, and I think Drake is just kind of evolved into a schmuck.
No.
So that's
Drake is currently in therapy, I assume, from this conversation, and he's taking a minute. Okay, he's regrouping, and when he comes back, he will have considered all of the words that you have to say.
I hope so.
I'll figure out exactly what he has to say about that. Look, we've barely, I think, scratched the surface of an incredibly super layered topic. I urge truly everyone to watch this PBS doc. It's really great. Gayle, what do you hope people take away from these conversations about the shared Black and Jewish American history?
I mean, one thing is that Black people and Jewish people have always encountered each other in everyday life. I'm thinking of another use of Yiddishism in rap, you know, MF Doom and rap snitch knishes, and a knish, you know, for people who don't know, is like a Eastern European Jewish pastry. It's kind of often like a savory pastry. And, so why is MF Doom rapping about knishes? Because he grew up on Long Island, and, it's part of like the multicultural Long Island that he encounters, which includes things like Jewish foodways, which are kind of woven into New York foodways. So, I mean, that's one thing, is that there's these kind of everyday granular relations that also sometimes find their way into the music. But I think that, the historic alliance can't be taken for granted. Speaking as an American Jew, I would say that it's really important for Jewish Americans not to romanticize that grand alliance of the 1960s, because it really ignores the ways that each generation has to fight for allyship and solidarity. It's not a given. It doesn't come just because, marched with King. It has to be fought for. And it has to be talked about. There have to be real conversations about incredibly tough issues that we keep having.
Mark, over to you. What do you hope people take away from these conversations?
I mean, besides the fact that I haven't had a good condition about 15 years, I think to Gayle's
because you're in
point
North Carolina.
But to Gayle's point, it's an ever evolving relationship. And we see, for instance, how it's playing out very differently on college campuses now. And so folks always have to pull back and look at the broader history of what this relationship meant, what it meant, and particularly moments of historical transitions like the early part of the 20th century, like the civil rights movement. And we're in those moments of transitions now. So young people are going to have to reevaluate what those relationships are going to look like going forward.
Jay, over to you, pal.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much there, and I hope this inspires people to keep digging deeper. Henry Louis Gates comes from a pretty particular sort of generation of liberal cultural intelligentsia.
And he's the one who made this documentary, I should say.
Yes. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but it limits the range of perspectives. I think there's also a tradition and history of alliances built around more radical politics that aren't explored as much, like Abel Meeropol, who wrote Strange Fruit. They don't mention he was also a lifelong radical communist activist, was the adoptive parent of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg's kids, which W.B. Du Bois helped to facilitate. So I think, there's a lot more history that you can dig into outside the margins of this series. And I hope it inspires people to keep connecting the dots. Not that this series completely shies away from that, but I think it's a really opportune moment to lean into thinking about if this relationship at its best is built around a shared commitment to principles that come out of our similar experiences, how do we, in this particular moment that this series is dropping into, how should we together be applying that to things that are happening right now, like Israel and Palestine, which the series does touch on somewhat, but I think there's an opportunity to lean in more and connect a lot more of those dots. So I hope that conversation continues.
Well, I really appreciate your insight and your time. You guys have been wonderful. Really appreciate it. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming on. Mark Anthony Neal is a James B. Duke Distinguished Professor of African and African American Studies at Duke University. Gayle Wald is a scholar of American culture and the author of This Is Rhythm, Ella Jenkins' Children's Music and the Long Civil Rights Movement. And Jay Smoot is a veteran hip-hop broadcaster and culture critic based in New York. That series that we've been talking about, by the way, Black and Jewish America, an Interwoven History, that is right now at PBS. My name is Elamin Abdelmahmoud. This show is called Commotion. We'll be back tomorrow. We'll see you then.